call us to order, and I'm going to ask Cashel to lead us in the pledge. And our flag's here.
I got it.
Okay. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Great. I am going to welcome Harry Frank, who's joining us from the VSBA, and he is going to help guide us through some work a little bit later in looking at superintendent evaluation and more specifically how they can help us out with maybe a 360 evaluation. But we're going to share a little perspective, and then he's going to facilitate a conversation that'll help him know how best to help us get what we're looking for out of the process and the experience. Comments from the public on items not on the agenda? Hearing none. Do we have any board acknowledgements?
I wanted to know, out on Facebook there was some notice about I'll have to look it up, but Stacy Bruins passed forward some information about a food market that's going to be held here in Founders in the first week of March. And I can look up the exact dates in terms of the Farm to School program initiative. And so that was the first I had seen of it. And so I just thought that would be...
That was in the email we got
It was a
today,
Gmail,
right?
Monkey, MailChimp.
Okay.
MailChimp? Okay,
Yeah.
I guess I didn't see that one, but I saw it through... it was re-forwarded through Facebook. And so, I just thought that was an excellent thing to note. Another thing is, again, great orchestra concert this past week, another music event. But another kind of side note that I just want to say about our food service, and this is an anecdotal with my daughter, who was just mentioning how they wanted to ask the food staff about, they've had these samples for this tortellini soup. And they've really liked it. And they asked, can you give us a list of dates? Because, quite honestly, we don't always look it up online, what's happening. They wanted the list of dates, and they actually brought them out bowls of soup. The girls were so excited. They had their soup, and they went back to the cafeteria to thank them. But it was a really sweet thing to do that. And I think things like that help encourage the kids to try more items.
That's great.
And so I just thought that was a very... anecdotally, I thought that was wonderful. So I thought I'd mention that.
That's awesome.
Shameless plug, we're talking about superintendent evaluation tonight. One of my goals, of course, is to... So thank you.
There you go.
Totally anecdotal.
I know that we had a day off at the middle school today, and I don't know if now is the time that we might want to just get any additional information since we don't otherwise have it on the agenda, because it was a
Sure.
unexpected
It was unexpected.
long weekend for the middle schoolers.
So under the auspices of 2.8 communication support to the board, you did see, if you were a parent, an email that went home tonight at 3 o'clock, sharing with parents the decision that I made this morning pretty early, about 20 to 7, when one of our boilers misfired, and it reminded me of the old days when I didn't have a wood stove that worked properly. It was just billowing, oil, petroleum, stinky, fumes around the building. Then our air handling system kicked in. Of course, then it spreads the smell around the building pretty quickly. So it was obvious in about 6:45, 10 to 7 that we had to get kids out of there. We quickly brought a technician in and checked for CO2 levels, which were fine, normal. But again, it was a kind of an irritant smell. And there were a number of adults who, were not able to even walk into the building because of it, because of just hypersensitivity to that type of thing. So we relocated to Founders. It was actually quite fortuitous, because we were just practicing as a leadership team relocation drills, and my charge to principals that we have to practice those and not wait for a natural event to happen. So Monday morning, I was thrilled that our buses started, but then the darn boiler stopped. But
wasn't Briggs
staff and kids did a wonderful job. I decided not to use the feature, the option of putting kids on buses. I thought that was too risky, given the 22 below zero and not having a true sense of who's going to be home to supervise kids. Buses were en route it was just, I just decided to have Mom and Dad notify. We ran into a problem with alert, with one call now, it only went home to their home and not to work. But I've never seen so many mobile units come out of kids' backpacks before, because they were texting within minutes, and within minutes parents were showing up. It was a misnomer to call it a gas leak. It had nothing to do with gas. There was a gauge that wasn't calibrated, and oil was pooling this morning in the reservoir, and then of course pooling oil is not good because it stinks, but there was never any risk. The Vermont gas turns off when there's rationing that happens because of the cold air. They shut our gas off, and we have to burn oil. We don't burn oil quite a bit, but they're dual boilers, gas and oil. So maybe because it hasn't been used, the gauge was not functioning, but it's all fixed. We shouldn't have a problem again. There is some residual odor, which probably will be a little bit annoying to some, but I felt we can open tomorrow, because having gone in there late today, it really wasn't that noticeable. But we learned a few things. Alert Now was one. I've sort of made an executive decision in the future we should send those alert notices out from central office. It was pretty early, sort of flying quickly without a lot of support in central office, so we did our best from the building level. We had UA teachers in the lobby, making sure, confirming it was Mom and Dad or Grandma and Grandpa when kids were leaving. And again, I think it went pretty well, all things considered. Teachers remained on the job here at the elementary school and EMS if they didn't find it to be objectionable, and so they put in a day. Support staff did not.
So, just in terms of student safety, it wasn't necessarily a designated person, because there were multiple kids, they were just at home with whoever picked them up. And that just is a concern in terms of safety of students, I understand. But I also think it just needs to be clarified to parents. So what if this was a bomb threat in 2 weeks, but the weather is 20 degrees? What are they to expect? And I think that caused a lot of confusion, because in the beginning of the school year, parents fill out a form saying what to do with their kids in case of emergency. That wasn't followed today. And that was very clear on it, that this will be how it's dealt with. So that caused a lot of confusion. And there were a lot of kids who could have gone home on a bus, have access to their house, but now it made it very challenging for them to get home. So I would love, it wasn't smooth. And I understand that all the kids were safe. I mean, safety for the kids was priority. I totally get that nobody wanted to have a kid dropped off on a corner and then get home and not be able to get home, think they got their key and they had forgotten their key. Totally get that. Totally get that. But maybe that needs to be clarified on the form, and what are the parameters that you follow this, and where else might you change it? Because even the school bus drivers were telling that we were going to be bringing the EMS kids home when asked. So I think there was even confusion among the drivers, because they thought they were going to be heading back here and bringing the EMS kids home. So
even though they were told that wasn't the case, but so
but that's what some of them, there were a few of them saying that. So, I think that was a misunderstanding on their part. But
no,
so
good feedback. I mean, even with the best laid plans, things get a little squirrely, and do the best we can. And we had kids actually leaving the building in the back door of Founders that we had to go get. It's busy. So our goal is to try to move as quickly as possible, because the longer you keep kids sort of corralled, the harder it is. So
I didn't know if you were doing a Big Brother, Big Sister Day or something at Founders. I'm like, where are the bodies going to go? Great little mentoring opportunity. Forced family fun.
I mean, it actually was. Fortunately, it was a holiday for many. Probably wouldn't have worked as well if it wasn't a lot of kids because of that.
There were a lot of kids and parents who hosted lots of little parties. Today they had a blast. The kids had a great time.
It was a good long weekend. Thanks for the update.
But I think those are some concerns that have been expressed too.
I heard a bit too, but I think it's just a matter of even clarifying. Maybe I think we've spoken about the idea of just why our ordinary procedure would be this, but given the temperature, we've made a decision that kids will be kept here.
And
a
if
little
they had
bit,
that
just a little
earlier,
bit more to know.
And earlier, because with only having the one call coming in
right.
at 8:30. I mean, the kids had all called all the parents before, and we were trying to get information.
Yeah.
It was very confusing. So
And probably you guys had the big kids coming over, the little kids coming in. Like I
it
can
had
only
to have been
begin to
chaos.
imagine.
Yes, I can only imagine
can
the
only
chaos.
begin to imagine. So I appreciate that. Ultimately, kids are safe.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming it sounds like we're not replacing the boiler. So I'm also
No.
appreciative of that. We've had this hypothetical boiler discussion around use of our
good
capital
question.
reserve fund, and
No, that
so
wasn't that.
I'm relieved that that's not our
That was the
hypothetical.
first thing I
since-
thought of.
I know. I was like, oh
Oh,
dear,
right, there.
we jinxed
Eric.
ourselves. We were talking about this at budget. All right. Any other acknowledgements? Updates? Okay. Then, onto the consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll move that we approve the consent agenda as presented.
And do I have a
Second.
second? Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Passes 4-0. Thank you. And we are pleased to have the opportunity and a willing gentleman in John Sonic to serve in the capacity of school clerk for us, which also has served the dual role of overseeing the election for us. And John Sonic was recommended by both Steve McQueen, who previously held the position, and Cheryl Mooney, who is our town clerk. And somehow this hadn't been on the warning a year or two ago, and we were. I know Steve has done this for years, and now he's retiring, and so that is somehow in there we hadn't had it on there. So we are in the position of needing to appoint somebody for this year, and our warning that we will sign for Mark, yes, tonight will include that position. And John has also said he is willing to get a petition and put himself on the ballot for that position for the coming 2-year term. He is, I believe, the gentleman who does the town meeting and oversees that town meeting and vote. And he is, I think, also a member of the Board of Civil Authority, so he'll be able to pool those resources around our election time. Steve McQueen is happy to work with him in transitioning, and I am just incredibly relieved and thrilled that he's available and willing and came with such high recommendations. So I would love if I might get a motion to appoint John Sonic to our school clerk for this meeting, and then, or this vote in this meeting coming up in April, and then he will do the other part for hopefully the next term.
So, okay. You can't believe this to me. No, so.
That's why I was thinking consent agenda. It's easy.
So I make a motion that we appoint John Sonic as our school clerk for the school election, the budget election on April 14th, 2015.
Thank you.
And for the annual meeting. Thank
Yes.
you very
And
much.
for what?
Yes,
The annual
the
meeting.
annual meeting. He, so I don't mean to.
Nope,
Let's have
go
a
for it.
second, and then I'll just clarify. Okay, thank you. So among those responsibilities is he'll certify our election results. He'll also, the secondary part of that job, which isn't technically the clerk's job, but that he will do, and that Steve has done, and it's probably been done together for more than 30 years, is that he will oversee the election as well as certify the election results. So
And moderate.
and moderate the meeting for us. So we elect him on the floor, so we don't have to appoint him for the moderator, but he needs to be appointed for the clerk position. Thank
How do
you.
you spell his last name?
Sonnsck. Thank you. I'm pretty sure. All right, so any further discussion? All those in favor? Aye. All those opposed?
Who
Passes for
seconded that?
Dan did.
Dan.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks. Passes 4-0. Thank you guys very much. And now we have, let's take a quick look at it and make sure we got this right. Our annual meeting warning. And we've got all of our positions. We have a term of 3 years on our board, a term of 2 years on our board, a term of the 2 years remaining in a 3-year term, Cashels, on our board. We have an opening on the high school board. We are electing a clerk, which we hope John will get his petition in and be able to be on the ballot for that. I would encourage you guys, if you know of anyone interested in this, I know that the high school position, that person is not running again. So if you have anyone in mind, feel free to have a conversation with them, or they are welcome to call me with questions, or Brian Donahue is their chair on the high school board, and he's a great resource as well. We have our budget amount in here for the coming year and the capital improvement as Article 5. The articles at the bottom happen at the meeting that immediately follows the vote. So it looks good to me. You guys want to take a quick look, and we can have a motion to...
This had been sent around.
It had.
It hasn't changed from
And in your board package.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and are we signing this?
You should sign
So
it.
we can sign
Oh,
it.
yeah.
So a motion to accept our warning, or accept it, right?
Annual one, yeah.
Accept the annual warning, anyone?
I move that we accept our annual warning as presented.
And Cash will second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Passes 4-0. Thank you. No, that's okay. That's fine. I'll take it last and I'll give it back to Mark. We might be able to get David on that later. Thank you. And now, the highlight of our meeting.
Thank you, guys.
We had spoken this summer, and I sort of preempted the conversation last week as well, about the opportunity to improve our process around superintendent evaluation. There are pieces of the work that we have done historically, and the biggest piece of it, being a policy governance board, is that we look at the monitoring reports for the previous year and put in that matrix, sort of compliance, non-compliance, is the interpretation reasonable? And if we can get it up, we're going to try and open up the documents to just show it for purposes of recording, the matrix that we use, and that captures the information we have from the monitoring reports. And to the extent we completed the feedback form for any of those, we would also have that data, and I may ask Cashel for help in making sure that I can pull that data and have it make sense. Dan has offered to complete the matrix this year. I had done it the last few years, and then Brendan did the qualitative sort of write-up part, and we put those two pieces together, and that was how we had conducted Mark's evaluation the last few years. Last year, there was another piece that Brendan and I put together to try and guide the qualitative parts of the job, that conversation. And what we discovered in that was that parts of that, when we were looking through it, we don't really necessarily interact with that part of the job description that Mark does. And it was where we came to this idea that we would like to consider a 360 evaluation or something that looks at the parts of the work that aren't the monitoring reports, but maybe the more qualitative aspects of the job. And then the third piece that we did this fall, or Mark did this fall, which I loved and I think we all appreciated, was seeing his professional development goals and the goals for the district, and how he supports our goals for the district, which we talked about over the summer. Those are the pieces of the work that we've done, and so where we reached out to the VSBA is to have Harry help us in this idea of a 360 evaluation, and having that maybe formalize in a better way the qualitative aspects of the job. And Harry's going to facilitate a conversation in helping us see what that might look like process-wise, but also help us sort of look at our 3.4 monitoring superintendent performance, make sure we're sort of clear on how we interpret it, and then provide him some guidance on what we want to get out, what is the outcome we're looking for from the 360 evaluation. Maybe it's not just about the qualitative aspects of the job. What do we want feedback on, and how will that inform Mark's development and moving the goals of the district forward? And then Harry will artfully put together all of our thoughts and come up with a draft tool for us, and then they'll help us execute on that and, pick groups to send it to and help us identify how to figure out who those people are. And, they've done this for a few districts, and we might be the first on the 360, or you've done some of this before. I'll let Harry take it away, but have I set the stage well enough that we sort of,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And take it away.
So, my initial comment is more of an observation, which I've made to both Kim and Mark repeatedly, which is I really admire what they and you all are trying to do in shape experience. It's more than a tool. It's more than questions and comments. It's really a thoughtful way of looking at what are you trying to accomplish? How do you leverage the process of evaluation, reflection, and thinking forward in the way that's most useful for the district and specifically for the superintendent? And so just to play out the thought one step further, there's no question that leadership is a critical function in an organization. And it's, I think in many ways, easy to, it's so nebulous, it's so broad and all-encompassing that sometimes it's easy to not attend to it. And we know from experience that when leadership turns over frequently, when there isn't effective leadership, that it affects the whole organization. So that's sort of by way of a little wandering to come back to say, so I was really pleased to get the invitation to be at the table with you shaping this. In the end, it is going to be a tool of sorts, right? It's a document that will provide a way of focusing your thoughts and your ideas and helping shape a direction for the superintendent's work. My hope, of course, is that the process is valuable for you all as well as, as a governing body, as a leadership team. So that's the perspective I bring to it. And yes, in many respects, I think beyond tonight's conversation, my work becomes more mechanical than design. But we've already had a number of sort of cycles to get to this point. So, I'm ready and willing to take as wandering a path as we need to get to the right end. So what I did after several conversations with Kim and Mark was sketch out sort of just a reference for tonight's meeting. So, Mark, you're going to pull that up. Okay, so.
I apologize about this. Is a second-hand machine. It's not showing. It's not illuminating the whole document.
Did I get it?
No.
Well, I think obviously it's going to be more of an issue for people that are trying to look online.
That's better.
Or on the.
Oh, it's like.
Oh, gotcha.
Is the thing not up? No, it is.
Well, truthfully, I think the part to focus on would be the questions at the top. The policy is taken directly off your website, so there's access to that document. I didn't realize that. I see. It's cutting off the top.
We could read them.
Yeah, again, you all can see them.
Yeah.
I think at this point we're grappling with how do we
There you go.
give other people access.
Wow.
I think that's the
Well done.
Good.
yes, thank you. And so these were the questions we shaped to organize tonight's conversation. A way to think about this broadly is to think about what are we trying to accomplish through this process, right? So the evaluation of the superintendent. That's point one. Number two would be, well, what in fact is a good superintendent, and how might we measure that? What would we be looking for? So it's a generative kind of conversation, right? And at the same time as looking at what do we want out of this process, what do we look for in a leader, we're looking back at what do we currently do. And so in some respects, there may or may not be a gap there. And I think the opportunity is to say what ought to fill that gap. And that's you described it, Kim, well when you talked about the qualitative dimensions. I think that's maybe what we're assuming we're going to get out of this, but let's see where it goes. So that's my thought, and the other idea for me to facilitate is to especially allow Kim and Mark to be involved in the conversation instead of orchestrating it. But as I understand, we have till about 8:20. We'll see how it goes. Should there be times to turn to other references like the tools you've used in the past or ones that I've introduced in this conversation? They're referenced on the back side of the page. I think we'll just play it by ear and see whether those are documents to look at to inform what we're talking about. So do you have any questions before we jump into this?
The only thing I'm wondering in terms of order of the questions would be, I wonder if we should take a look at interpreting the policy first.
The policy 3.4?
Yeah, because
to really get grounded in what that means.
Just to start there, knowing that maybe specifically by that policy we wouldn't need to do this other piece, but I think we might need to acknowledge that, like take a look at it and sort of figure out why we're looking for more as a board, to articulate it if for no other reason because it's the first time being shared with the Policy Governance Network and by maybe straight up by the book Policy Governance.
I think that's a great suggestion. Yeah. Is that something that you can do in sort of a initial summary and then get additional comments from people? How do you want to do that?
Sure, or I was just going to say if we move that up and maybe move that down, just if we look straight at what I see as that policy and without imposing an interpretation on it so much as it basically says, like, we're going to monitor by monitoring reports and that determine compliance by that, and that's really the sole source of evaluation, and that's how I interpret that in like a sentence or two in that policy. But I'd happily hear whatever other interpretation people have of that, or thoughts or suggestions.
No, I agree. I mean, that's
the
basics of it. Well, we have these tools, and that's what we're going to use to reference what we perceive that performance to be.
Yeah, and I think my sense of why we're even having this conversation is there's two things that we've said we're going to evaluate. One is how well do we achieve our ends, the other being the organizational operations. The ends is pretty easy. I mean, let me rephrase that. The ends is pretty easy to evaluate. I mean, you give us the data. Here's the data. Did we make our ends? Did we not? I think it's the organizational operation. How do things actually function within the district? We hit on that on a lot of our monitoring reports. Treatment of staff is a big one there. But I think, in my mind, that's the hard one for us. It's because those aren't. It's harder to come up with good, crisp, hard numbers. The charts of here's how our students did. We don't have a nice chart of here's how our staff feels about the joys of working at Essex Town School District. We don't have a chart for that. And so to me, that's my sense that that's why we're having this conversation, why we're trying to do this larger evaluation, getting beyond just the ends. If that's, if that fits.
I think it would be helpful to hear from the other board members and Mark as well about what it is that you get from monitoring reports. And I appreciate that you reminded us that part of my interest in being here is also passing along this conversation, or reminding other policy governance boards around the state that you're doing this work and suggesting they look at this tape and look at these documents. And so it's a professional development sort of resource. So there's that other layer as well. So maybe some of what I'm interested in is more basic, but I think it's probably important to revisit briefly. So I think, Dan, you and Kim have spoken. What do you understand you're getting from monitoring reports? I'm curious, Cashel and Rachel, if you would say same things or something different. What do you understand is the substance or value of monitoring reports as you currently use them?
Well, I think a lot of times it's taking that look at what is the data, but also what we have enjoyed is also having we've enjoyed when Mark or other people on the leadership team have added a little bit of quantitative in terms of this is a piece to the puzzle. And so we get to see where the ends are at this point. So where they are along meeting the ends, whether it's student performance, whether it's student safety, whatever the aspect is, but also knowing what is the plan from here to continue to improve it. And to me, the value of the monitoring reports is seeing where we are now and hearing what their thoughts are and what their plans are to get us to the next step.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, in my mind, when I look at superintendent evaluation, I feel sometimes that's the piece that's missing is we can say the monitoring reports are, we've got this.
Mm-hmm.
How do we help continue to go down this path of from good to great, in using that same terminology that we use throughout. But I find that's the value of monitoring reports is getting that. I love straight data. I can deal with stats, I can deal with numbers, but also hearing the story of where we're going from here and what our plans are. This is how we're hoping to achieve this. And hearing that, there's more than it's the team, it's the leadership team, it's the teacher groups, and I'm totally missing
Literacy coaches.
And how that all works together to then get us there and how we align everything to that.
Yeah, that's a great addition. Cashel, do you have other thoughts in response to that?
I agree, and I think that's what I was excited to hear. Why I was excited to hear about Mark's, professional development goals, because this is my first year on the board, so this is all new for me. But I felt a really helpful impression of what the big picture is. So we get the monitoring reports, and that's like a moment in time. And I agree, it's hearing that anecdotal information that comes along with the presentation of that data that gives us a sense of the bigger picture and where we're going. And that's what I felt like we were getting from Mark with, your goals, your personal development goals, that, okay, we know where we think we know where we want to be as a district, but, it's kind of all the feel good that comes along with it too, that I think adds a lot of value to who we are and what we should be able to be proud of and communicate to others.
Yeah.
I also liken the monitor reports. Using the analogy of driving a car, constantly checking, am I going the right speed? Am I going the right speed? A lot of times, you don't study the speedometer. It's kind of like one of those boom, boom. Okay, yeah, I'm still the right speed. And some of our monitoring reports are like that. They come up, they go, cool, we're good, and it takes 5 minutes on our agenda, and others take an hour and a half, and we're like, wow, we still haven't covered it all. And obviously depending on what the topic is, but it's an interesting tool because I feel like here we are, in essence, we're trying to direct this vehicle, but we're not the ones with our hands on the steering wheel or the gas pedal. Mark, and so we're just, it's almost like we're backseat drivers. We say, Mark, here's where we're trying to go. How fast are you going? But I think that's kind of our role to choose the destination and then make sure we're getting there. And that's, I don't know if that analogy helps.
I think it's great. It's a new one, and I have to again comment. It seems to me that policy governance can sometimes be an obstacle to the work because, I'll try to use your analogy, some people get so focused on going 56 miles an hour or whatever it might be, that you lose sight of where are we trying to go and what's the experience we're having in the process. And I think it's a credit to your work that you describe it the way you do. That, we know where we want to go, although that may evolve as we're going, but we have and so we're checking the signs, and we're confident that we're going in the right direction. So
I think the context piece is helpful with the monitoring reports, so that the data on its own kneecap results or whatever, SBAC, whatever the results might be, if they were to come to our table without the context for the plan or the work or what it means for kids or the cohort, and those are the reports that would mean a whole lot less if they weren't put in the context of what we're trying to achieve for kids. So those become a data point or an indicator of success or areas for improvement, but one of many. And then Mark's challenge to come up with other ways to demonstrate that we are moving kids towards those ends, and all in the context of the end that we're looking for. And so it puts the picture together rather than us just getting a bunch of little dots. And we get a lot of updates to those that come in sometimes in isolation, but it never feels as though it's an isolated just glimpse at something. It feels as though it's always coming in the context of the policy that it's monitoring. So even when it doesn't come in the big package, we get those updates in a way that makes more sense in terms of what's happening for kids. And I agree with Rachel, the piece where we get to hear from teacher leaders or see the walls, the data walls that are being used in each of the buildings, like each one of those little cards is a student, and that seeing how those kids are moving and knowing how closely the adults that are in these buildings are caring for each one of those little squares of those kids and their movement along that progression is the confidence that we can have as board members without needing to know all the mechanics. That frame of reference is pretty powerful to really appreciate some of the work that's happening without us having anything to do with micromanaging it, just understanding it a little better, so that we can be good stewards and advocates for the work we know that's happening.
So those are examples of the kind of other sources of information that you were talking about, like data walls, student performance. Yeah. Okay. So, Mark, I trust you'll chime in where you'd like
Harry,
to.
thank you. Yeah.
But do you want to make any comments on this conversation about existing practice with respect to monitoring reports, what they're intended to do, what you hope they're doing, what you add to along the way?
Not in particular. I find this
Okay.
policy to be a little bit dense. And this board this is a policy governance policy. I mean, it wasn't necessarily designed by the board, and over the years, I think what's been lacking is that more qualitative piece. And so when this board that was brought back a job description, which I think we'll get to at some point, either not tonight but in the future, that was trying to get at what Dan was getting. How does the place work? I mean, what's the feeling of joy? Are the systems aligned? Are they working? We think they're working because the monitoring reports suggest that they are, but it's sort of like that backstory about my leadership, my management style. I think the board was trying to get at through the job description, and you can't get that through a monitoring report. So I do think that's why, in part, why we're here tonight is this doesn't really open up other options unless you add to the existing policy those features which you've talked about, professional goals, 360 evaluation. That's absent in this policy. So you could stretch maybe indirect reporting. There's ways maybe to find a way to, but I think maybe in the future this should be revised as actually specifically, in addition to monitoring reports, what are some other features to the overall monitoring system that gives you that type of information. And I think that's too hard to find it in here.
Yeah, I find in here, our policy really says the only thing we're going to look at is the ends policy. Did it work?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, wait a minute, what about all that other stuff? And I think it was just a pendulum swing. I wasn't here when the policies were created. And, I came on about a year after the whole policy governance thing had happened. But it feels kind of like the pendulum swung too far, where it was like, okay, now we're only looking at this one narrow thing, and now we're trying to sort of bring it back to center.
And maybe even more importantly, because we're pretty good about disciplining ourselves to monitor that which we say we're going to in policy. And what we've actually done is always had sort of a qualitative discussion that hasn't really had a formal structure to it, but we've always delivered, at least I think in your tenure, Mark, a matrix that evaluates all the monitoring reports, but then a qualitative sort of write-up that had less structure to it. And because we're pretty good about disciplining ourselves to monitor that which we say we're going to in policy, because it's absent in policy, because we didn't really have a structure or a formal piece to that qualitative discussion that became a sort of a write-up that went on top of the matrix. I think that's part of what we're trying to do. Like, while we have, a good thing going, let's figure out how we codify it so that it can be in policy and spoken to in policy, and our work can do what we do on almost every other place, is really hold ourselves accountable to policy. And it's absent in policy. It's been existing in practice without much structure to it. And that, for me, is missing.
And then when we've evaluated 3.4 most recently, that was a thing that we had discussed, was that it needs to be, whatever we do has to then be captured in policy, and we need to revise as to whatever we decide should be our focus, should be part of the whole evaluation process. We need to then capture it in policy, so that way it provides that extra structure so we can go forward.
And Mark knows what to expect, and we know what our responsibilities are, and they're pretty clearly laid out. To jump to how we describe it in policy before figuring out what we think can work didn't feel right either. Like, I think we're working from a good place, that we're always, every year there's an evaluation. Every year it is heavily the monitoring reports, but every year there's another piece that is less, predictable or clear around what that will contain. So.
The other piece here, and I think it does have to do with monitoring, and that there has to be a thoughtful approach to providing monitoring reports as it relates to ends that's balanced with sort of like the end, the result, but also the means by which we got there. Because if you just put out a 360 evaluation without the board having a context of what the work looks like, then I think it's hard for them to understand what the results are telling them in a 360 evaluation, if that makes sense. So if I report out on literacy and math, acquisition of, attainment of standards, without telling you about the work we're doing in the district on how we're getting there, vis-a-vis coaches, literacy specialists, and revising our curriculum to reflect new state standards, new performance-based assessments. If you ask questions in the assessment or the 360 survey about assessment or curriculum or instruction, and if you don't have that backstory about the work we're doing, then I think you wouldn't know how to work with that information that people are filling out on the survey. You know what I mean? And I've got some superintendent colleagues who are just really, it's all about just the end. It's not about the means. And I think that we've been able to demonstrate we can walk that line between a fair amount of means discussion, being judicious with that, along with the real conversation that is the so what did kids get there. And I think there's a little bit of both in any type of report, and I think we've figured out that balance.
Yeah, I think the means discussion, when you come in and say, hey, here's some examples of what we're really doing, helps take it, as Cashel said, the monitoring reports, like, here's a snapshot in time. And the means discussion sort of shows how we got to that snapshot and where we're probably going. And it sort of, I don't know if it blurs it, but it gives it makes it more like a time-lapse photography as opposed to that moment in time. Which I think is very helpful, because I could imagine, and this is, I certainly don't think this is at all the case, but I could imagine a superintendent going, hey, the monitoring report looks acceptable, let's just kind of sit here and let it coast. And that is just so completely the opposite of what you do. You go, hey, here's our monitoring report. I think I'm in compliance on most of these things, and here's what we're doing to be even more in compliance, to be even better. And that's, so that level of means conversation, we make a big point of saying, we're not here to talk about means, but you give us enough of the means to, again, be able to see what's going on. Even if we're not deciding what those means should be, we're recognizing.
So it sounds like there's general agreement that there's a good practice in place to provide just what you summarized, right? Enough information, context with respect to means, both looking back and looking forward, as well as a snapshot in time about what the data tells us and how that informs where we're going. And so the other dimension of the conversation has been what you're calling qualitative dimensions or aspects, right? And so that's what we need to try to be more specific about, right? Because you've done something, you've had conversations around the qualitative dimensions of Mark's work that's yielded a narrative of sorts that accompanies the evaluation based on monitoring reports. But now what you're trying to do is frame that in more, right, okay. All right, so I just want to throw one caution into the mix here, and then the question is, I mean, I think they're pretty close to these questions, but they're slightly revised, but it really is, so what are those qualitative dimensions, which I guess you might say is similar to what makes a good superintendent. But anyway, I don't think we'd have to stay to these word for word. Here's the cautionary note, which is a couple times people have talked about, we want to get a sense of how people feel about their work and what the culture is here. And I shouldn't even have quite said it that way. I don't by any means say that that's not valid, that is in a sense a data point. On the other hand, I think we need to be really thoughtful about how do we ask those kinds of questions, what are we trying to elicit from people, how do we use that information, what's the purpose of it. And in some respects, a 360 model is designed to try to mitigate the range of feelings, and I'm just using feelings as a reference point because I think those tend to be more unpredictable, circumstantial, personality related, all of which, again, is data. So I think the 360 model grew out of the recognition that, in any situation, two people are going to have a different experience. How do we validate that, get all that information, use a process for reflecting that acknowledges all that, but also looks at, okay, we've got this wide range. How do we make sense of that? And I think that's ultimately the challenge that a board has, or I mean, it's a leadership team, right? Because Mark's going to be looking at this with the same kind of, intention as the board is. Like, what do I learn from this? How do I use it to go forward? So maybe it's not cautionary, but it's just a little bit contextual to say, okay, I think we also need to be thinking about where are we trying to go with this. So, the question is something like what makes a good superintendent, or what do you mean when you say the qualitative dimensions to the work, or maybe there's a third way or fourth way of even asking the question. But I think it'll be helpful for you all to speak to that, because then obviously we're working toward how do we shape questions that help us get that information. What are your thoughts on that?
I think a huge part of what we're looking for, or at least what I'm looking for, and I immediately recognize the danger you identified, is the how different groups of people feel like they fit into shaping the district and performing, driving the district forward. And I mean groups of people being teachers, support staff, parents, students, the community to a certain degree, the non-immediate school community, but the larger Essex community, because they are, after all, our taxpayers. We refer to them as the owners, or potentially the businesses that we try to have work with some of our students. And seeing how those different groups feel like, not how they feel, but how have those groups been incorporated into shaping the school and making sure their needs are met. Obviously our I don't know if I should say our biggest school need, or the ones with the most significant needs, are the students. After all, that's why we're here. But I think the teachers, the parents, the community have equally valid needs as they relate to the school. And as you said, the danger is there's 2 or 3 people who feel very strongly. We hear about them. What about the other? I don't know, how many parents are there? There's so many we don't hear from. And what I've found when we've kind of sat down and tried to come up with our qualitative evaluation for Mark at the end of the year, the things that come to mind are, of course, the people who are most vocal. And this, again, I'm hoping that we can reach some of the people who have significant feelings about how the school is going, good or bad or whatever, that aren't necessarily quite as vocal. But I think that how those different groups interact, how the superintendent interacts with those groups, I think is a huge part of creating the culture, making sure we are driving our school in the direction that the owners want.
Yeah, yeah, that's well put.
I don't have the answer to this, but are we wanting to brainstorm some of those qualitative aspects so that we might give Harry a little something to work with to try and give in the audiences that we're talking about? And I think Harry shared a document with Mark and I early on in the process that sort of, I think, hit all the groups you mentioned, Dan, in terms of, you know, the net that we want to cast to have people provide some feedback. And if we're feeling as though if you're feeling as though that would be helpful to you,
Yeah, I think that
Harry,
is.
then I think maybe we want to sort of name some of the things we're looking for, or give Harry something to work with to give us a draft so that we can say, oh, that was sort of what we're thinking about, or we have a job description piece from before that I might even have copies of with me, or you may, Harry, that are these still valid? Are there other things that we're looking for? But those stakeholder groups, I think, were all those that you mentioned, Dan, I think were all those that you had shared for suggestions.
Yep.
And I think I heard you say other municipal leaders, other community leaders, so that was one I would make sure we had if we didn't. I don't know if we just want to throw stuff out.
I think that would be
Is
great.
that
Yeah,
helpful?
yeah. Yeah, I'm curious, Kim, where your thoughts are. You know, I guess I had posted as how do you describe those qualitative aspects, or what are you looking for in a superintendent? I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to frame that question. So yes, we're in the brainstorming phase, I would say.
You know, we always talk about the teamwork, the collaborative work among the teachers, and we see it in some pieces, but again, it's not something that's captured quantitatively when the leadership team comes in. But how does that whole framework, the leadership team down to the teacher groups, so that the teamwork amongst administration through to the teachers, you know, support both ways. You know, is there support both ways? Is there to help achieve the goals that are there? And I don't think we may anecdotally be able to come up with some situations, but again, that's not something we've ever really captured. That's one piece.
Can I just add a thought back to
Yeah,
that?
please
Yeah,
do.
So
please do.
I think there's an interesting dynamic that school boards are, you know, constantly navigating, which is you live in this community. You are not a anonymous bureaucrat that's you know, governing an organization. I mean, you have most board members have kids in the school. So talk about being close to what's happening. So as I hear you talking about teamwork, collaboration, which I think are really central pieces of, you know, quality, culture, I think there's two sides to it. One is support, meaning, you know, is that encouraged, resourced, you know, cultivated. I think the flip side, and I'm thinking about the superintendent, is that expected? Is it held up as a standard? I mean, requirement might even be the right word, but in other words, I don't think a superintendent's job is just to support collaboration. It's to
Enable.
So you know, and this is that balance when you start going qualitative that I think is really important to keep thinking about. Okay, it's not just being supportive. It's also, role modeling. I mean,
Creating an
they're probably,
environment for it too.
yeah, there's probably a lot of ways to talk about it. And that's the kind of cautionary note that's always in the back of my mind, is how to strike that balance. So.
Well, I could think of two characteristics off the top of my mind that would facilitate that. One is a sense of, well, maybe even three, a sense of innovation, a sense of what's new, what's not necessarily what's, the newest crazy idea, but okay, what is the development of teaching, education, theory? What are the new ways of looking at things that have been reasonably scientifically validated? And again, I could imagine, as I said earlier, a superintendent saying, "Hey, all the means are, or all the ends are great, so let's just keep doing what we're doing and nothing change." And I think having that sense of what can we do differently to make this even better, what are the maybe not having all the great innovative ideas coming from the superintendent, but as you say, facilitating the other people who have ideas in the community, whether it's teachers or obviously the example that jumps out in our district, the Edge really kind of came with it. Let's do things a little bit differently. The parent who approached with the Martin Luther King ideas, say, hey, how can we facilitate? That's an idea that maybe we had thought of, maybe we hadn't, but how can we facilitate that? So that willingness to seek out as well as hear the innovative ideas of people, I think is a very good quality. But then, as I say, there's a certain amount of scientific validity that also has to go into not just trying the latest wacko scheme.
But an example of that, Dan, would be that, the Common Core, which is not, a wacko scheme.
No. Well, some people would.
In Vermont, we're not talking about it as such. There might be other states. But that feels as though it really came as no surprise. It's work our district has been engaged in terms of working towards standards, in terms of the development work that's happened in our district for a number of years now. And so a sense of thinking proactively and looking at what's coming and how can we be strategic and how we deploy resources to support the work. Really making those connections with resources and strategic work.
I think as importantly as it is for a superintendent to be thinking, thinking innovatively, strategically innovatively outside of the norm, more importantly are my colleagues thinking that way. And am I, fostering that same sort of feeling of, change is important, and it's not just about what the AO is telling me. It's about, I believe this in my heart that kids need a different something, and I'm willing to take the risk and innovate and experiment a little bit outside of my comfort zone. I think that's what you're looking for in a superintendent, someone who can sort of decouple the evaluative piece of what I do with encouraging people to try something different. So that's one thing. The other is boards. We haven't talked about this a whole lot. We've intimated through anecdotes that change is hard for a lot of people. When you look at research, educators in particular are more on the conservative end of change than people who might be in private industry, and that's just part of because we're always being told what to do by someone else, and to take risks, not wanting to get it wrong, it's hard for educators. So I think it's important when we look at innovation that we understand the change continuum and where we are as an organization, Essex Town, on that continuum. I would not say, for example, that we are left of center, left to center, and that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying, so as you expect, if innovation is something you expect, recognize that as an industry, we don't change easily. We've had the same calendar for over 100 years, and it's even bringing up one day of a change excites people. No, nothing ill about that, but that's the challenge of what we do. So I think it's important that we really understand what it's like to innovate in a culture that doesn't really encourage it.
Yeah, I think that's my point, or my thought is, all the innovative ideas aren't supposed to come from you. There's no way.
That's right.
And you've got how many? 150 people, educators out there who can have
The incubator's the
amazing- yeah.
classroom. That's where it should come
It's more not the idea comes from you, but the culture
That's
to
exactly. I
facilitate
agree.
to grow those ideas.
Take risks. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you've got an occasional idea of yourself, great.
Yeah. That's right.
But you're growing, helping everybody else grow their ideas.
That's the key, I think, Dan. Yeah.
I think effective communication, so that
This comes from.
you become.
Thank you.
I thought you might have needed it since you had the left and right. a little confused. I wanted to make sure you were kept awake over here. And so I'm just thinking, all the great work in the world can happen, and it also needs to be able to be communicated effectively. With articulate and thoughtful communication that sort of elevates everyone's education on the topics.
That's interesting, because I was going to give you a hard time about communication because it's such a big word.
Yeah.
But when you just said it needs to be articulate, thoughtful, and elevating, I thought, well, those are some pretty clear descriptors.
Okay, that's what I meant.
Yeah. No, because I
And to
mean,
a variety of audiences.
Right.
Because you've got several
Yeah.
different audiences that could be receptors, and they might all need different levels of communication at different times.
yeah. Yeah, no, right. I mean, communication is like leadership. It's so big that unless you give particulars to it, but articulate, thoughtful, and elevating are pretty clear descriptors. So,
One of the things to prompt our thinking, if we need more prompting, is when I think about it, I'm trying to think about, again, we are operating in a really fortunate situation in that we have a superintendent invested in us doing this better and not defensive and helping us make this a good process. And so what if we didn't? Like, what would we be hiring for? Because there'd be things that Mark does that we may take for granted, or we may appreciate tremendously, but what would we be looking for if we didn't have Mark? And how do we recognize those things, or make sure that any areas that need development are identified, because those are things that would be important for us if we were hiring for someone. Just as a
And I was trying to look real
Another
quickly
one.
to find the job description real quickly.
we can share.
Okay, just because I think that's, if we were looking, that would be where we'd go to. And a lot, if I remember right from previous discussions, a lot of what our job description talks about isn't how to do the monitoring reports. It's all these other pieces. If that's what we're looking for, but then we never evaluate it again,
Right.
I think that's the missing link.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about when I was invited to meet different groups of folks in the spring of 2010. I don't think monitor reports ever came up.
Yeah, and most people,
in terms of people's
Yeah.
interest in
Yep.
what can I
Well, very
Well,
true.
with the exception of the 5 people sitting at this
Well,
table, probably
right.
no one
Yeah.
would have known what a
Right.
monitoring
Right.
report was.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
The other, I don't know if we captured this in anything else, but the other thing that comes to mind would be like engagement. So, we talk about innovation and all of that, but is our superintendent an engaged leader, or are you passive? And just sort of like, okay, great idea, make it happen, or enabling that culture and in an engaged way.
can you keep going here? 'Cause so engaged, and it sounds like that's partly what Mark does, and it's partly how other people respond
Yes,
to him.
right.
So,
So,
Can I just?
yeah.
Well, maybe not. So I don't want to. We should try to be careful not to make it about me, because there may be what I do well, but there might be some things that I need to do better. So I
Right.
think the engagement piece. You're looking for a leader who can engage
Yeah.
people in the next big idea or where we need
Right.
to go forward.
And
It
not
shouldn't
just
really about
be
me.
the leader as a figurehead,
Yeah. Yeah.
but are you part of that process? And
Yeah.
So I think that's what I was hearing you say, that it's half of it is what does the superintendent put out, and how do people respond to that? And engagement looks like, I think you were saying something about being energetic in the way things are presented. So I was just trying to get a few more descriptors to go with, because again, I'm thinking about, okay, how do we shape questions that,
yeah, exactly.
that help get this information, and that's why I was prompting you to just talk further about it. But I don't know. Do you have other thoughts on that, or other people want to chime in here?
Trying to think of how else I could phrase that myself.
All right. Well, it's about what the superintendent puts out and what he or she elicits from other people as well.
It partly is the communication thing. You know, if it's very clear communication, obviously the receiver is more likely to interpret it the way the superintendent intends.
And be responsive to that.
But if we go back to that engagement piece, so that goes a step beyond providing information and education.
Right.
That engagement piece is another
it's more actionable, perhaps. Like it's not just providing the information, it's providing the environment with which to make that information actionable. You know, I kind of go back to that, like, you're not just a figurehead. You're somebody who has, or we want somebody who is actually, like, boots to the ground, you know, engaged in that work.
But does that also then link into problem solving and dealing with conflict? Because again, not all those, when you have an engaged public, sometimes it's just not all smooth sailing. It's navigating waters that might be trickier because of different opinions, either from different groups or different people within the groups. So whether that's leadership team to outside groups, to how to help navigate that with the vision of the school district.
And like in a productive way.
In a productive, Does that make sense?
And I think along those lines, we've been talking about all these rosy things, but there are some downsides. There are some thorns out there also. The conflicting constituent groups being one, but then also the issue of sort of a discipline model versus a growth model for problems that arise. You know, is the approach to an employee, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a support staff, whatever, who's not performing. Is that person disciplined, or is that person facilitated to grow so they can perform? Are they given an opportunity to develop? And obviously there are situations where it's like, no, sorry, that's just unacceptable. But sometimes, I think usually, there's an opportunity to help that employee, just as our teachers help our students overcome challenges, helping if the administration can help the employee overcome their challenges, whatever, so that they can do their own job much more effectively. I think that's and I know, again, we have seen that in different situations. So I think it's a long way of saying what's the I don't like the word discipline, and I think that's
continuous improvement. I think
there,
so.
A
term we've heard or see evidenced in a lot of the work. It goes to that idea that the monitoring report's value isn't just its snapshot; it's its plan. That Mark is always thoughtful about sort of sharing both the snapshot and this is the progress or the progression or where we're looking to go. So I think that would be something we'd be valuing and seeking. I think listening, we've spoken about communication, so it may fall under that, but the notion of having people feel as though they're heard and that there's, follow through if appropriate or necessary. That doesn't mean you're everybody's best friend. That would not be a good superintendent, probably. But that you can disagree with people and have people still feel heard and respected. And so, however we might capture that, that'd be something I'd be seeking if we were not so fortunate to have that.
So there's two other areas I want to ask about. I was looking at the form that you sent, Kim, which is, as I understand it, sort of the way you tried to structure the conversation about qualitative
We
components before. And I just thought I would read the sort of topics. So they're
We could
organized.
just send it to everybody if you guys are.
This Google thing,
We were
can't
going to
call
try
it
and
up.
pull it up, but we couldn't. So.
I think
Sorry,
it should be manageable, just because I'm just going to touch on the broad topics. As a way of prompting, are there any other areas that you want to touch on? And I do want to try to squeeze in a minute for you to think about how you as a board work with the superintendent. It's a dimension that you've mentioned a couple times, Kim. And I've been struck as I listened to you about the parallels, because I think you could insert board in a lot of places along the way, but I think it'd be worth just paying a moment's attention to that before we finish. So, but here are the broad categories that you've talked about before. So under, broadly speaking, leadership, there's planning, interpersonal and collaborative skills, and then partnerships, professional, which I think means partnerships of a professional nature, and community connections. So those are the items under leadership. And then the second big category is management. So there's leadership and management. And under management, there's personnel, curriculum, instruction, and assessment, fiscal planning and budget management, safe and effective learning environment, and educational records and reports. And you can see how their management is very much of the operational dimensions, and leadership is talking about the broader components. So I was just saying, well, that might be a good prompt. Is there anything that you think of as you hear those broad categories that we haven't touched on? And then again, I think it would be helpful for you as board members to reflect on, one of the expectations you have, and again, I think it's been woven throughout, is how the superintendent works with you as the governing board.
I know we mentioned a group that we'd be interested in hearing more about in terms of other leaders among the community. But I almost think that in a lot of ways that's almost we see Mark do it, and I can't imagine now having the superintendent not have that sort of interaction, for example, with Heart and Soul, and that sort of, it's not captured anywhere, even in job description, really. But it's something that illustrates his commitment to education. But there's not really a place to say in the future that's what we want, or to recognize it even within the process, or and I think that's a piece that we value.
I think that's huge.
Even with the state board, the SBA, as Vermont School Board Association.
So it's external relationships.
It's external
right?
relationships.
Community leaders, initiatives, state
It's captured
level.
a little bit in 3A there on the
And this was a
but-
tool that Brendan and I put together, looking at the job description from, I think it's on the VSBA website, probably the superintendent sort
the
of
model job description.
job description,
Yep.
I think,
Okay.
or what we had from when we hired Mark, and that's how we kind of pulled this tool together
Yep.
from before. But I think I would wholeheartedly agree with Rachel, just in the way Mark's, I think, respected and perceived in our community, has borne out a lot of collaboration with our neighboring districts, with our town offices and the town plan, and people are thinking to make that connection, that they would want to be in touch if there's something they need our opinion on, and that's, I think, huge, and would definitely be something we'd be seeking and are grateful to have.
What about when you think about the future and the growing interest in having a stronger partnership with our sister district, CCSU, whether or not it comes to fruition around a merger, but in looking for a leader, is there anything that we haven't talked about that that's particularly aligned with that body of work that you'd be I mean, the connection with the community is obviously important, but I wonder if I think about systems thinking. Yeah, I think you were talking a little bit about sort of the organizational indicators that represent is the organization working. But when you think about that that work with CCSU and the systems issues, are you looking for, you mentioned problem solving, but analytical thinking, being able to connect dots and understand efficiencies and effectiveness go hand in hand, that type of thing. It's like the smarts that go into the job.
That's right.
I don't know how, you know what I mean?
No, totally.
Like there's this qualitative piece around, can I get everyone sort of coalescing around the moving forward, but there's an analytical piece when I think about
see the big picture.
Yeah, the big picture.
Yeah.
You look at these two systems, similar but not, and been able to make sense of those two worlds.
Well, even outside of the big picture, or unification, or any other context,
I guess, yeah.
Your big picture thinking has moved us from 3 different buildings to a pre-K district. I mean, that has been a really tangible effect of your leadership over the last handful of years that is because, in my opinion, you're a strong systems thinker and you can think about the whole and the journey of the child, and that's would definitely be something that I think should have a place to either recognize, or if that were absent, to be speaking to it in an evaluation. Yeah. A little thing, or so not little at least at all, is organizational skills. And I know that sounds like one of those sort of organizational skills, but I'll tell you, most evident sort of in the work we're doing around contract negotiations is the really following through on things and keeping everything together. And I'm sure Dan can probably testify to the fact we're very grateful for it not. You're writing down stuff all the time, Mark, and I think that it's not just going off into nowhere land. It's actually the follow through is important, and the ability to absolutely be wearing as many hats as any superintendent is wearing at any one time, and to continue to be able to follow through and keep things organized and prioritize is huge. And I think maybe that's a given in any leader, but it may not be, and I would hate to see it missing.
I want to just take a second and go back to a little bit of what Mark was saying when he was talking about, in terms of big picture merge. Do we ever say anything to the vision? Does the vision the superintendent has match what our vision as a school board is? And I don't have any answer. I don't have any direction I'm going with that, but that's the question that totally came to my mind. And I don't think that you'll always have, I don't think every superintendent in the state of Vermont would have necessarily the same vision as every school board. Does that make sense?
So there's both a question about, on day one, are they the same? But isn't it also a question about how do you navigate those? How do you bring them together? How do you build a shared vision?
Yeah, and it could very well, like I said, I don't necessarily have a direction. That was just the thought that came to my head as Mark was talking and thinking potential future.
Well, and also thinking of Mark having shared his goals. They weren't, but had they been just purely about stuff that wasn't, we would have said so what to. He was able to articulate his goals, but also explain why it was important for moving the district forward and how it aligned with the district goals and our goals. And so, I don't know how that's captured either in a question or a characteristic, but that those things are aligned in seeking outcomes for the district. They're not, some of them may be personal goals as well around personal development or growth that he finds to be important, but we didn't hear about him wanting to run a half marathon or anything. It was not, there wasn't a personal goal set out that didn't have some alignment with what he was looking to achieve for outcomes for the district or kids or supporting the board or otherwise. So it was outcomes focused.
But I think you raise a really important point, and the first job of a leader, if it's not to, really, put yourself in the vision of the district, is to either create one or reinvigorate one. And I think there's always been a strong vision here, and I think part of the work that I started out with is to reinvigorate that, which included thinking, 10 years pre-K-8. And I think it's always been there, but it just took reinvigorating that to make it happen. I mean, the board's always been clear for 30 years in terms of where they want to be. And but you need a leader who is aligned and can continue to model that. Yeah. And I think you probably have experience area statewide where the superintendent's vision and the board's vision isn't the same, and that could be fairly, problematic.
I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
We come in all shapes and sizes, don't we? We boards.
So I want to respect your timeline, but I really want to throw an unfair question into the mix. This is going to be a process. The next step will be for me to, very much in consultation with Kim and Mark, start shaping questions, which are going to need to come back by you for refinement and finalization. But if you had to pick one area that we've touched on tonight that to you is the most important, what is it? And again, it's a little bit unfair because obviously there's probably many things that are important here. But I'm trying to get sort of a gut level check on, like, this is like the number one. This is my number one.
My first gut reaction to that
You're out of time.
was no. I'm just going with what my gut reaction was. The minute you said that was leadership, because without the leadership, in order to help direct, you can't have the vision. You can't do anything else in order to encourage, enable people to go in the direction that whatever needs to happen has to happen.
Yeah, that's great. You don't have to. It's a little bit of an unfair gut check, but I think it could be helpful for me in trying, because the bottom line is a survey with 30 questions is not going to get the response that a survey with 10 or 12 questions. So we're going to have to prioritize some, and I don't think that means cutting out things, but I do think it would be helpful to really try to focus them. So and you could pass at this point, I suppose, but if other people have a sense of where their top priorities, that'd be very helpful for me.
I'm going to still casuals and say facilitating the creativity and
Innovation.
Enabling the
enabling the innovation of the.
We like
that
that word enabling right now, don't we?
It's great. Great.
Yeah,
Facilitate and enable the creativity of the
Great.
people in the schools.
Yeah. Other.
I would just add, personally, I would add the word engaged to Rachel's leadership. Because again, you can be that person, but if you're not there with your group, then are you really that valuable? So you have to be the engaged leader.
Yeah, that's great. Kim and Mark, any initial reactions?
I think big picture systems thinking, because I don't have to say the other two. So, because I know we'll at least get 3 or 4 questions, won't we?
Yeah.
That wasn't that. Okay, all right, I got you. Mark, any
No, this has been a good conversation. I think the engagement maybe is the word that maybe resonates with me the most, but someone who just values people and diversity of opinion, embraces this notion that it's just never going to look the same. And it's constantly, change in education means just one thing after another, and you have to be sort of at peace with that and enjoy people. And I think depersonalize the experience as much as you can, and I think we've talked about that tonight, but it is that humanistic part of leadership that I think is, you have to be, I think, a servant leader. If you look at Sir Giovanni's stuff, it's serving the owners, it's serving kids, it's serving people. If you're not a servant in your leadership, I think it's not necessarily a good match as a superintendent.
And I think one of the things that I've heard you say every time you've spoken, not to us, but out at some facility, you've always said, Mark Andrews, I have the privilege of serving superintendent, or serving, something
Essex
along
Town.
those
Yeah.
lines. That's how you introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's really it's neat.
It's what I believe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And while you depersonalize in that you're not defensive, you personalize in that you sort of walk the walk, and you mentor a kid. The things that you feel are important, you engage in them as a model.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is the engagement piece that you mentioned. It's not just, I think this is important, folks, and here's why.
Right.
It's I'm going to sit with you on some of these things because I think these are pretty important, and I want to be a part of it. So,
So
and
you
that
wanna-
point, it's personal. So.
I was gonna say you may want to underline engage because it seems like we're really like that word.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Harry,
Well,
you have
I-
your work cut out for you.
Well, but I mean, that's what it's fun
Thank
and
you.
interesting. And again, so my reflection back to you is actually an appreciation. I mean, the character of the conversation and the insight is extraordinary. And I think it will benefit you all. I hope it will benefit other people as well. So thanks for, being receptive to this work. And obviously we're, partway into it, and there's more steps to go. So, but great conversation and good direction to go.
Good job facilitating.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
And we'll get back to you guys when Harry gets his drafts. We'll
Yeah,
share
so-
them, and then we'll bring them up. It'll be on the next agenda. I don't remember exactly when that is, but it's not next week because of vacation. So it's a couple weeks out.
Yeah, that's good. So we'll make
Yeah,
sure that
but,
there's a draft to
I
look
think
at
it's
when you
the ninth.
Second week in March,
Yeah, that would be nice.
Right.
a little bit of a hiatus.
Yeah.
Since we've enjoyed seeing each other weekly.
Wow.
It has been pretty much weekly, hasn't it?
It has. It has.
We'll go through it.
I'm going to step out, but thank you.
Thank you,
Harry,
Harry,
very
so
much.
much.
Thanks, Harry.
Wait, so we gotta make sure Kim gets
Yes,
these
please.
because
Some of those for the road.
if she's gonna be giving up chocolates in here.
Oh gosh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Moving to executive session.
I will take a motion to move into executive session, and we need to read what it's for. And then
I will move that we move to executive session to discuss contract negotiations and for a board self-evaluation.
do I have a second?
I will second.
Go.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. 4-0, moving into executive session. Thank you all. Thanks, RTN.